Welcome back to 7 UIs with Replicant. This is CRUD Part 2. In this episode, we're gonna try to write a better test for interacting with the UI. Last time we wrote this test that asks to set the family name filter that just checks that there is an appropriate action on the input, which is okay. It's not bad, but it could perhaps be a little bit better. What could be better is that everything in the solution is data. The rendering is data, actions are data, and the action definitions are very simple. But currently they're trapped in this core namespace, which is a CluderScript file that can't be run on the JVM. So we could write the tests in CluderScript, but it's better to be able to run them in both runtimes. So we're just going to port the core namespace over to CLJ-C so we can run it on JVM as well, because then we can actually execute actions in our tests. I'll just rename the file and then we'll need to find all the js/interop. So this date here we're using several times. So we'll just create a JVM equivalent one. Like using Java util date is not a good idea, but it doesn't really matter for this example. In a larger application, I would typically use Java time and something that provides a Java time-like API for CluderScript as well. At my work, we use CLJ-C time, which I'll link in the description, which is really good. Now this delayed dispatch, we can just use thread sleep. And the render part doesn't need a JVM variant because we're not going to use init from the JVM. But now we can actually use Nexus to dispatch actions in the tests. Let's write a different version of this test that checks not the action, but that the effect of executing the action is that the list is filtered. To do this, we're going to need to create a store, an atom, put the test data in there, and then we can dereference the store to get the state. Then we'll get these actions that we can dispatch with Nexus. And now we can refer to the Nexus map that's in the core namespace. There it is. Pass in the store, pass in some event data. And then actually we can't really easily create an object like this. So we're going to have a JVM variant that uses a map instead. This is a little bit like stubbing inside your production code, but this will get compiled out of the CluderScript in any way. So it doesn't matter too much. Now the target should have a value, which is what you typed in. So let's just type in mus. Now we're going to render over again with the dereferencing the store, which will now be updated. So the two states here will be different. And then we'll look for the list rows and expect only the mustermans to be displayed. So it says nil, that was not expected, and that's because we're using select one instead of selecting many. This is pretty cool. This is basically a sort of integration test that only uses data in, data out. There are some details here that we can get rid of by creating a couple of helpers, but I think this is a very compact and cool way to actually interact with the UI without having a web driver and all the complicated setup involved in instrumenting an actual browser. We can create a helper function here called dispatch event, which will take the store and some hiccup. And then we'll pass in the selector here. And we'll need to pass in the event type, which is this one. Which event are you dispatching? And then also an event. To use this, let's go find our example again, and we'll convert it to using dispatch event. Call dispatch event. We'll pass in the store and we'll pass in the hiccup that we get from calling render on the store. And then we'll get this selector and we'll grab the event. That should be it. We'll take this down to our test and replace this. And then it says, did I do everything right? says store. Yes. Okay. So we're missing actually the event type. I just put input here and then the test works again. So now it's almost as compact as the previous tests, but we achieved a couple of things that are pretty cool with this one. First of all, we're not specifically expecting what actions are being run. That's now an implementation detail, which they probably should be. And instead, we're just executing it and making sure that the next render will bring the UI to the expected state. I would eventually like to get rid of this atom inside the test, but let's write a couple of more tests using this helper to see how it feels in real use. So now we can take the next interaction, which is that clicking a person should select them in the UI. So in this case, we're going to need a lot of the same setup, create the atom. And then we're going to dispatch an event where we click one of the list rows. Render again. And then we're going to select the li, that is the list row. We don't actually need to pass it an event because it doesn't use any placeholders that it looks inside the event. And then we'll do this render and find the people stuff. But now we only want to find the people that have been highlighted in some way. And actually we'll use PG secondary, which is going to give it a very noticeable highlight. Wrong arguments again. It seems that I am incapable of passing the right amount of arguments to this dispatch event function. It takes 1, 2, 3, 4 arguments. Yeah, once again, we didn't pass in the event. Perfect. There we go. And now I don't get any names out because our code is not highlighting anything. So that means that we have to fix two things. And this will also highlight what I think is perhaps the drawback of this kind of test. But let's see. So first we'll render the person. They'll need an action here. It says start editing person when you click it. And the reason why I say editing instead of highlight is because it's also going to pop up in the form on the right side, but we'll get to that later. And start editing is just like the other action. It's just going to stuff it in store somewhere. Person like so. And then we have to actually look for that person, which means that we need the state for the render person function. And so now we can check if or yeah, we'll pull out editing. Okay, we'll wrap this in a cond. And then if we have an editing person, we're going to highlight it, just like the test asked for. Secondary. We have to also evaluate the core namespace now to have the new action added. And then the test fails because I get all the names out. So that was surprising. But I'm getting all the names, which means that we're adding the PG secondary class to too many people. Aha. We only want to add that class name to the person that is selected, not everyone when some person is selected. If we do that and evaluate again, we have to actually put an expectation in the test, and there we go. Test is passing. Clicking person selects them. If you click one person, then another person, it should only highlight the second person. So let's check for that as well. That only highlights one person at a time. We'll just copy this one and we can refine the selector here to look for a list row that contains a specific text. This is a lookup specific selector. Musterman Adriana. So this should bring her name up as highlighted instead, which it does, which is very fine. And then the last point is that if you click the highlighted person again, they'll be deselected. We'll just have the same event dispatched twice, and then there should be no highlighted names. And that currently fails because we're not handling that case. That means that we'll need an if here because we also need an action if you're selected. We're gonna swap those around, put this in a map, and then we'll add a click event here. That's just gonna stop editing. And the stop editing action will do the same thing as the start editing, except we'll just put a nil in there, and then there's no editing person. Like so. And then once again, we'll have to evaluate core, and then we can go back to the test, and it's still failing. This failure allows us to discuss the drawback of this kind of test, because like I said, it's a good thing that is less about the implementation details, because it's not looking at the action that powers this interaction. But that's also what makes it give less good feedback when it fails, because we now do not know if the test is failing because we didn't execute the correct action or because we did the wrong thing when rendering in response to it. This test covers basically two things in one go, and when it fails, it's hard to know which part it is. But we can do some rappling around to figure out, which I think is good enough, because not hammering down the implementation details in the tests is very good in the long run. So let's have a look here. It has put the person in editing, and if we dispatch again, it should be gone. Which he is not. That means stop editing. So now we can do the render then to make sure that the action looks correct. It says stop editing with it's missing the namespace. So it should be a double colon when there is only a single colon. Yes. One single colon. Oh my god. So now we can just get this test back on and evaluate, and now it's green. Which means, by the way, that we should have working selection in the UI. Which we very much do. So that is pretty cool. You can even click to deselect. Before we kick off for now, I want to do a little bit of refactoring to see if we can get rid of this atom. You can notice that when we have multiple dispatches, what we're really doing is that we're starting with some state in a map, and then we're performing a bunch of interactions with the UI, and then we're making some assertions on what rendering that state looks like. So really we want to pass in a map and get a map out after applying the interactions. So let's write a helper function that does that for us. And we can call this function interact. And it's going to take the state as a map. And it's going to take a render function and interactions. It could have called CRUD render UI directly, but by taking the render function, we can make this, move this to a test helper and use it in other tests as well. It's going to put the state inside an atom, and then it's going to loop over the interactions, which will just be like tuples of selector, event type, and event. And then for each one of those, just call dispatch event. Pass in the store, call the render function by dereferencing the store, and pass in just selector, event type, and event. And then after that, it's just going to dereference the store, and then you get the map out. So now you can rewrite this block of code in the following way. You can interact by passing in a map. We'll make this indent very nicely. Actually, we're going to pass in the render function, which would be cool to have up here. So let's make it indent 2 instead. And then we can have the list of interactions on the second line. So here's the selector, and then there's the click. And we just do these two, and this will return now the new state. So we could just put this directly into the threading that we have at the bottom here by putting it in here and doing the render call. That's pretty cool. We'll put this in place of this test. So the cool thing about this, I think, is that we get rid of the atom, and we also get things a little bit more compact, and we have this useful interaction helper that we need to use for other tests as well. Yeah, this actually does interactions in the wrong order. Let's flip them around, and now the tests are green. And then we'll do the same with all these tests. There we go. The last thing I want to do is just pull this out and put them in a test helper, since they're not really specific to the CRUD stuff. And we just make sure we'll get all these namespaces required in here. Oh, still thinks that this is a CluderScript namespace, which is wrong. Remove that one. And then, yeah, like so. Grab the helper in here as helper, and then we can do interact. So actually, if we put the render function first, we can partially apply it in the tests. So the tests get even a little bit more compact. Partial helper interact with CRUD render UI. And then we can just remove this one. And then we can actually also put an indent hint on this local, because now it indents after just one argument. That works beautifully. It's still true. We can now go around and just remove these render UI, the function being passed. There we go. Now that's a bunch of beautiful tests. And now we have this really powerful interaction helper that we can leverage when we build tests for the buttons in the next episode. So that's what I wanted to do for this time. Hope you enjoyed it, and then I'll catch you in the next one. Thanks for watching.